What we're going to do tonight is through dovetails. So we're going to do something like this. And I'm going to guess that most of you know what dovetails are, but just on the off chance that you don't, this board, which is basswood and has these flared pieces on it, that's the tail board. And these look like the tails of a dove, so they call it a dovetail. And then the cherry board that fits together is the pin board. And the great advantage of dovetails is that they actually have the mechanical advantage. The joint locks itself together. So this is why you often see them on drawer fronts, because when you pull the drawer front, it actually makes the joint tighter, but you're not really moving it. But if you were, you have that advantage that it's not, the drawer side can't come apart from the drawer front. But I realize I'm jumping really deeply into the weeds, and I just want to say, step back and do a few housekeeping things first. So if you are here tonight, that means you got the email with the Zoom link, which is good. I do apologize for the trouble with Thinkific, which is normally how I would be communicating with you, and it's where you can go and find information for individual lessons that we have, and it's also where there will be a community so that you can ask questions and I'll respond to them, or other people in the class will respond to them. We can have conversations about what's going on. All right, so hopefully we're in business now. So what I was saying was, so there was trouble with Thinkific, but it has been resolved, and we can start using that again. So tomorrow morning, the on-demand version of this will be available on Thinkific to watch, and next week you'll get an email from me that will come through Thinkific, and it will have the Zoom link. So that'll be next Wednesday morning. As I mentioned, today we are going to do hand-cut dovetails. Next week we are doing the table saw dovetails. As for next week, a lot of people will ask, do I have to have one of those specially ground blades for a dovetail, for a table saw to cut dovetails? You do not need to have one. Next week I will show you what it looks like when you cut them without one, a tail, and then I'll show you what it looks like when you cut a tail with the specially ground blade. So I'll show you both. You don't have to have one of the specially ground blades. All right. All right. So let's just we're going to dive right into it with hand cut dovetails. The first thing about really dovetails, or really furniture making at all, is that it all really starts when you're milling material. So if you want to cut good joinery, whether it's dovetails, mortise and tenon, or whatever, you have to start with boards that are straight, flat, and square. Okay? So I've already done all of that, but I just want to point out that is critical. It's very important that, this is assuming you're making a square case, right? But that your boards are flat, straight, and have square ends. Everything's cut square, and it makes all the joinery layout accurate. It makes cutting things easier, and it makes just the whole process a lot easier than if things are a little bit wonky. All right? What I'm going to do tonight is walk through the process of just cutting a single joint like this one. All right? I might do more tails, but it's going to be just a single joint like this. And the process is the same no matter how many you have to cut. The only difference is if you're making, say, a wall cabinet or some type of case that has dovetails at all the corners, and you're cutting them by hand, what you would do is stack your pin boards together. Stack your tail boards together, and you cut two at one time. It makes things faster. And I should also say, it might be obvious, but I do cut tails first. I do not cut pins first. Some people choose to cut tail pins first. They do that at the North Bennett Street School. And it is okay that they do that. It's, it works fine in some situations. In most situations, it is preferable to cut the tails first. And I always cut my tails first. All right. So we talked about milling up your stock. You need it to be square. Now let's talk about the tools that you need to hand cut dovetails. These are the tools I need them to cut them the way I cut them. All right. You need to have some type of back saw. In other words, it's a hand saw that has a spine on it. This is a Western style back saw. It cuts when you push it, and so the blade is a little bit is thick, and the spine is usually pretty thick. A really small one like this is specifically called a dovetail saw, and you can use this in the stock up to about 5/8 of an inch thick, somewhere around there. Once you start to get into thicker stock than that, you would want to use what's called a carcass saw. Especially if you have two boards stacked together, you would want to use a carcass saw. This is good for drawers, where the drawer sides are going to be 1/2 inch thick or thinner. All right, so you want a back saw like this. The teeth are ground or filed for a rip cut, because we are cutting with the grain. And so you want a saw that is either filed rip, or you can get something that's called a hybrid file now. That's something in between a rip cut and a cross cut. I prefer, I think, a rip cut for this work. Another option, there are some Japanese dozukis. Dozuki means is a shoulder. It's the shoulder of a tenon. So these are traditionally cross-cut saws, because when you're cutting the shoulder, you're cutting across the grain. But you can find these specifically made for rip cuts, like this one. I bought this one from Lee Valley. And the teeth are actually ground or filed for a rip cut. So you want some type of back saw. I also think that you need to have a coping saw of some sort. I often use this one, which is from a company called New Concepts, but I also have another one, which I got at Woodcraft, and the body, the frame itself was like maybe $20, and it works fine. It works great. Ideally, you have a nice thin blade in there. All right. So you need, I would also say, a coping saw. Why? The coping saw just speeds the process up. It gets rid of the waste very quickly, as opposed to chopping it out with a chisel. Speaking of chisels, you're going to need chisels. What width you need depends on the size of the dovetails you're cutting. The best, if you want like one chisel that you can use for this and all kinds of other things, you would want to get a bevel edge bench chisel. And you would want to get one where the edge of the chisel is very, very short, so that it almost comes to a point. That allows you to get into the corners where the tail is. It allows you to get into the pin socket and clean it out and keep those corners nice and crisp. All right. Other types of chisels that you could use, if you're really doing this a lot with hand tools, you might get a chisel specifically designed for cleaning out in between the tails. And those will come to, they're like shaped almost like a triangle in cross section. And they allow you to get very tight into the corners and keep them nice and crisp. There are both sort of Western style chisels that are like that. There's also Japanese style chisels. They look like bench chisels, so they'd have a shorter handle. I had this one and another one custom made for me in Japan so that they would be more like a paring chisel. When I make dovetails, all I'm ever doing is paring, so I want to have something like a paring chisel. Then you also need to have some type of marking gauge. All right. And I prefer a cutting gauge. A cutting gauge has a knife in it. And it cuts a very clean, crisp line at the shoulder. There are other types. I make my marking gauges. So if you're wondering where I got this, I made this. But you can buy cutting gauges commercially. If you can't get a cutting gauge, the next best thing would be to get a wheel gauge like this, because the wheels can actually be honed on, or sharpened, and you can get them very sharp, and they will cut almost as good a line as a cutting gauge. I guess if you got it really sharp, it would do just as well. But the reason I like a cutting gauge, I'll show you very quickly on a piece of scrap. So I'm just going to So can you zoom in on that? Good. So this is from a cutting gauge with a knife. It cuts a very clean, precise line, which we will use as a reference when we're paring to create our shoulders. Contrast that with the wheel gauge. And this is not super duper sharp, but it's reasonably sharp. And that's a pretty good, clean, crisp line as well. But if it's not sharp, what it'll do is it more like it crushes or dents the fibers rather than severing them. And if it's sharp, especially like the marking gauge, it actually cuts the fibers. And that's what you want. Do not use a pin gauge, which is the type that looks like it has a nail in it, because those don't really sever the fibers cleanly, and you want to cut those fibers cleanly. So a cutting gauge is ideal. A wheel gauge works really well too, but you want to take the wheel off and hone it with your water stones and make sure it's really sharp so that you're getting nice, clean, crisp cut fibers. All right. Any questions so far, Joe?
What blades do you use for the coping saw? Are there specific blades for the coping saw?
For the traditional one the $20 frame, I have always used blades by a company named Pegas, I think is what it's called, Pegas. What you have to be cognizant of is the kerf of your back saw in relation to the kerf cut by your coping saw. So if you have a Japanese saw, which has a very thin blade because it cuts when it pulls, so it's under tension when it's cutting, it can be thinner, then you need to have coping saw blades that have a much thinner kerf so that they fit down into the kerf left by the Japanese saw. A Western style saw generally has a wider kerf, so you can fit a wider coping saw blade, or a coping saw blade that cuts a wider kerf down inside it. So when I first got that coping saw from Woodcraft, I just bought whatever blades they had there, and they worked fine with my Western style back saws. With a Japanese saw, one thing that's nice about the new concepts is that the blades have very, very minimal set to the teeth, so they fit down into the kerf of the Japanese saw without messing up the kerf. All right? So I didn't mention this, but you can ask questions in the chat feature. Joe will say them out loud into a microphone so everyone can hear, and then I'll answer them. All right. Let's get started cutting some joints. So at about 8 o'clock or so, we're going to stop and take about a 5-minute break so that everyone can go to the restroom, so that I can get some water, and berate Joe off camera.
For the beginning, yeah.
For whatever he's messed up. Sorry, I thought I silenced this, but I didn't.
Rookie mistake.
I know. So we'll take about a 5-minute break, sometime around 8 o'clock. Let's get started. The first thing that, I've got I've got a tailboard and I've got a pin board. The first thing that and these are the same thickness, because this is like cutting a case joint, all right? It's not like a drawer where usually that's a half blind and the two parts are different thickness. This is like carcass joinery where the two pieces would be the same thickness. What we're going to do first is set the marking gauge. And the question is, do you set it to the exact thickness of the boards? Do you set it a little bit short of the thickness of the boards? Or do you set it a little bit above the thickness of the boards? And what you do has an effect on what the joint is like after it comes together. If you set the knife or the marking gauge so that it's actually deeper than the thickness of your parts, then when you bring the joint together, the end grain on both pieces is going to be sticking out. And some people cut their joinery and do it that way, because then all you have to do is clean up the end grain. You can try to get it exactly set perfectly, and then when you bring it together, in theory, everything's going to be flush, which is nice, because then all you have to do is just do a bit of hand planing to clean up the exterior, and everything's hunky-dory. Then, if you set it just a little bit shallow, you end up with the face grain sticking out above the end grain. And that has some advantages. For example, when you clamp things up, the jaws of your clamps touch the end grain and can put a lot of clamping pressure on the joint without the end grain interfering with them. If your end grain is proud, then you can't really clamp the joint up over the joint unless you use some type of caul. So if the end grain's proud, it makes clamping it a little bit difficult, but it does, I guess, in some ways speed up cleaning things up afterwards. I don't really buy any of that, so I don't ever do that. Because you still got to clean up the outside no matter what. You got to get rid of the end grain, and then you got to clean up the long grain so you can do your finish. If they're perfectly flush with one another, or if the long grain, the face grain, is a little bit proud, clamping up the joint is a lot easier. The one advantage to having the face grain be proud is if you set your marking gauge for, let's say, 1/4 inch, or let's say 3/8 of an inch, because your drawer sides are going to be 3/8 of an inch. Well, then when you mill up your drawer sides, you make them just a tiny bit over 3/8 of an inch. You clamp it all together, and you have just a little bit to hand plane away. But when you're done, you know that both of your drawer sides are the exact same thickness. And that isn't always the case if you do it the other two ways. All right, that's the one advantage there. What I'm going to do tonight, and what I tend to do more often now, is try to nail it exactly right, so that there's less work to do after the joint comes together. So I just need to tighten that down a little bit. I will point out that you'll see me using a lot of the layout tools that I use are very small, like this marking gauge, which is something I made myself. It's really small. You'll see, I'll be using some squares and stuff, which I didn't run through the layout tools you need, but we'll get to that. You'll see a lot of most of my layout tools that I'll be using are also very small because that's the right size to be doing joinery like this. It's much easier to use something small like this than it is to use a big giant marking gauge. So I have this set, and it is, if anything, it is like less than a 64th shy of being exactly the same thickness. This is my tailboard, and I'm going to scribe a line across the face grain. I like to make it nice and deep, and why will be, I'll explain later. So you're going to come across the face grain and come down the edge. It's critical when you're doing this edge that you keep the fence of the marking gauge tight and flush and level on the end grain so that this cut line on the edge is square to the cut line over here. And that is important when we get to the point of fitting the joint so that you don't have a gap there. Because if you do that layout poorly, then you could end up with a gap between the tailboard and the pin board here, and this could be the front edge of your cabinet. So you would not want to have a gap there. So you got to be careful with the layout there. All right, so we've done a face in the front edge. I flip it over and then do the other face. And the other edge. So when you're doing hand cut dovetails, you scribe a shoulder line on all four surfaces, the two faces and the two edges. On the pin board, you only scribe a line on the two faces. And that's because, if you look at this sample joint, this is the pin board. This doesn't get cut away or anything. You don't want to have a gauge line cut into that edge, because there won't be one here, and it would just look ridiculous to have a cut line there. So you don't need it, don't do it. All right, so the gauge lines are all done. And so for this particular joint, we're done with the marking gauge. The next thing we're going to do is sort of pencil out our layout, draw our tails, and then cut the tails. To do that, you need, you need a pencil. You can use, if you use a traditional pencil, which I often do, you want it to be sharp, so sharpen it before you do it. Or you can use a mechanical pencil. This is a 0.5 millimeter, which I'm using for this. You also need a bevel gauge. So a bevel gauge has this adjustable blade to it, which can go at any angle and then be locked at that angle. So you need one like this. You don't need one like this. You could also just have a less expensive one, because the one I held up before is not cheap. But it is the best one I've ever used. And then you're also going to need, I would say, a 6-inch and a 12-inch rule. I'm not saying that you need to have the ones I'm using, but these are the ones I use all the time, so I'm going to use them. So these, it's just a 6-inch and a 12-inch rule. Mine happen to be kind of like squares. They're made by Veritas, and I like. You'll see why I like this one, and you'll see why I like them in a minute. But you could use a traditional, just straight rule as well. All right. Layout begins. this. Let's look at the tailboard. So you have, so this here, this looking at the basswood, that's a tail. In between the tail is a complete pin. Out here on the edge is what we call a half pin. When laying out dovetails, I begin with the half pins. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. On something this size, I would make this half pin about 3/16 of an inch. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure in 3/16 of an inch from the edge of the tailboard. Is this going to work? All right. So this is why I like these, because I can hook it at the edge and very easily mark that 3/16, and it's not, you're not trying to hold it at the end of the board because it automatically hooks there. All right. Now the next thing I do is draw the tail lines there, because when I'm laying out, I want to see what I'm doing, because that helps me figure out the spacing that I'm going to use. I never do uniform spacing. I always do some type of tails that are different sizes. All right. So if you were doing perfectly, where all your tails are the exact same size, you would do the layout in some different way. But this is how I do layout, because this is how I cut my tails, how I like my tails to look. The angle, I'll be completely honest with you, I really have no idea what angle my hand-cut dovetails are, because the first time I ever cut dovetails, I was learning to cut them from Joe Mazurik, who taught me to make furniture, and he just took the bevel gauge and set it at something and was like, here, use this. And so I cut all the dovetails for this big walnut tool cabinet at that angle. And I don't really know what it is. And then, after I made the tool cabinet, anytime I needed to cut dovetails, I would open up one of the drawers and use the tails on the drawer to set my bevel gauge. And then when I started to cut them at the bandsaw, I used that same angle. So and these are at that angle. I don't know what it is, but it's probably somewhere around 10 degrees, which is, I think, it's going to be somewhere around that 1:8, 1:6 ratio that people talk about a lot. It's not all that critical. The only thing you have to be careful of is that if you make the angle too pronounced, then the thicker stock you have, so if this really angled in severely, the thicker the stock you have, the narrower the bottom of the tail is. And that could compromise the strength of the joint. So on really thick stuff, you would want to go with a less severe slope. But you can see this stuff, these boards, I believe, are around 5/8 or just under 3/4 of an inch thick, roughly the same as what I have now. And this angle is not too steep for these. So but I also am kind of telling you that because I don't want you to, there's no hard and fast rules here. So part of it is aesthetics. Does it look nice? But then there's also that consideration. Does the tail, does it get too narrow at the bottom? And if it's too sharp out at the corners, that becomes really weak and it can break off. So you got to go for something that's sort of in between. All right? Looks nice and doesn't compromise the strength of the tail either down at the bottom or up at the top. All right. So I'm going to draw these tails. And you'll notice, and I should have said this earlier, but I'll probably say it several times. You know, the key to good dovetails, no matter how you make them, the most important thing is not cutting the tails and it's not cutting the pins. It's layout, good, accurate layout, and that's whether you're doing the tails or when you transfer the tails to the pin board. It has to be accurate. You have to understand what your layout lines mean and what they tell you. And then fitting the pin board to the tail board. Those stages, those three things, that's where dovetails get made and made well. So a lot of focus is often on how is my line cut perfectly straight and things like that. That doesn't really matter. It's layout, transferring, and then fitting. That's what matters. All right. So I've got the two outside of my tails done. Now what I'm going to do is find the center of the board. And the way to do that is to take your 12-inch rule and put one end of it up here at the corner, and then angle it down until a whole number falls on the other edge. So here it's at 8. And half of 8 is 4. So I've just put a mark at the center of the board. No math involved, no fancy measuring this, measuring that. Just a good old-fashioned trick for finding the center of a board. All right? That one I learned from Norm Abram when I was a kid watching New Yankee Workshop. I'm going to bring that line up to the end of my board. So I have a thing for doing 3 tails, and this board is not so wide that I need to introduce more. So I'm going to do 3 here. In the center, I'm going to do one, this one was 1 inch. I think I'm going to do 1 1/4 inches. So I'm going to do 5/8 on either side of the center line. Scratch that. I'm going to do 1 1/8. So I'm going to do 7/16 on either side. Sorry, 9/16. And I'm going to draw that in. So there's the middle tail, already drawn in. Now we just need to mark layout for the pins that go in between, the pin sockets, and then draw those lines in, and we'll have all 3 tails done. It's 3/16 on the outside. Traditionally, if it's a half pin, you make the full pins double that. I never do that. I'm actually going to make them the exact same, so it's going to be 3/16. And again, these things that I'm telling you now, like how much should your pin be? How much? It's all personal preference. This is what I like. You can change it. But the technique for what I'm going to show you in terms of cutting and things like that applies. That applies to everybody. If you don't like my layout, it's perfectly fine. Everyone's allowed to be wrong in their lives at some point. But you can go do your own layout. Have a good life. I'll see you later. Sorry. Joe and I have been laughing about that tonight. Now, because these are hand-cut dovetails, I'm going to take the tail lines and I'm going to transfer them across the end grain so that I have something to guide my saw as I'm cutting. And some companies make specialty dovetail layout tool markers that give you this angle and across at the same time, but then you're locked into their slope angle. I'm just going to use a square. And sort of the way to do this, which I'm not explicitly saying, is you take your pencil and you can place it down where you see the other pencil line, and then you bring the square up to it, and then you mark, rather than trying to get to the square lined up and then putting your pencil there. That's a trick that I guess I borrowed from doing layout with a marking knife. Because you can put the marking knife in the line that you just cut and then move the square up to it. And I'm sort of doing the same thing but with a pencil. So now I have the slope for the tails, but then it's also marked across the end grain. All right? Do we have any questions there, Joseph?
No.
Nope. All right. I tell you what we'll do is get through cutting the tails and cleaning them up, and then we'll take our little break. You don't want so I'm setting this in my vise to cut, and you don't want to have it sticking too far up. The farther up it is, the more your sawing is going to introduce chatter or vibration, which is going to make it harder. So you want to get it down low. I prefer, when I cut, to have the board square. Some people will angle it so that when their cut is square. I'm going to have the board square and my saw will be held at an angle.
Couple of quick questions.
All right.
Jeannie said, yeah.
You're going to read into the microphone, right?
Yeah, they can hear me. Oh. Jeannie said, why do you mark the front with scribe but then pencil the rest?
One, I don't know if I've ever...
Actually, that was Sean, sorry.
Yeah, so the question was, why do I not use a marking knife to lay out the tails? I'll be completely honest, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone do that. But also because you have to understand, so what a marking knife line means as opposed to a pencil line. The pencil line, see, I'm about to cut this, and let's say I don't cut it perfectly, which doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter if I get it perfect or not. If there's a pencil line there, it's just a pencil line. But if I do a marking knife line, it's actually cut into the fibers. And if I cut away my pin socket, it's possible that that knife line is still there. And now, after you put the joint together, you're going to have to hand plane that away. So I would not use a marking knife for that reason. I think it complicates cutting tails because you would have to cut it perfectly. You'd have to either go inside the layout line entirely to get rid of it, or you'd have to cut perfectly down that line, or cut it imperfectly and then pair it. But that just introduces extra work. So the pencil line is sort of like a visual indicator of what you should be doing, but it doesn't matter if you don't do it exactly perfectly the way the pencil line is, because it's just a pencil line. All right? And unless you really screw something up when you're cutting, the angle's a little bit off here, this angle's a little bit off there, that's not gonna register with anybody when they see your case. It's just not. So the pencil line is fine. And honestly, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone do it with a marking knife. People will transfer the tails to the pen board with a marking knife. A lot of people do that. All right.
Jeannie asks, if it bothers you to have a scribe line on the shoulders, does it not bother you to have one on the outside face of the pins?
No, it does not bother me there. So Jeannie asked, because I'm not bothered by a scribe line. Well, there's not one on here because it got planed away. But sometimes there's a scribe line left here and here and here and here. So, okay, well, if that doesn't bother you, then why would it bother you here? Well, there's a logical explanation for why it's here. There's absolutely no reason for it to be here. So why would you put it there? It's sort of, I'm sort of teasing you a little bit, Jeannie, but only because I know you. It's like asking me, well, if you're not bothered by having a side view mirror on your door, why are you bothered by having a side view mirror on the roof of your car? It's like, well, because there shouldn't be one there. There's no reason to have one there. There's no reason to have this line here. So you don't have one there. I mean, it's just, it's just extra work. Why would you,
It's an implied line, too.
It's an implied line. Like, I mean, I guess. I mean, no, it's not. On the tail, on the pin board, there shouldn't be one there at all.
Right, no, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to cut, so I'm going to cut my tails now. I'm going to use my Japanese saw. All right. Cutting. A lot of woodworking, success in woodworking is about body mechanics. Okay? The last time I had someone in my shop recently, and we spent 4 hours in the morning doing hand-cut dovetails. And the first thing he was cutting like this. You can't do that. You have to give your arm a clear path so that it can move straight forward and back like a piston. If you stand in a way that your elbow has to move out to clear your body, you're introducing an arced cut to the saw, and you're not going to have good saw cuts. So you have to stand basically parallel to the saw, and with your legs spread so that your feet are about shoulder width apart. And if you're using a Japanese saw, some people will hold it like this. I guess I tend to hold it like that. You can also put the saw on the inside of your arm, and that will help keep everything straight. You also do not hold it too tightly. All right, it's just a loose grip. With a Western saw, you would have, again, your index finger pointing out towards the front, your other fingers and your thumb wrapped around the handle. And again, it's a loose grip, okay? It's not, you got to think of it, it's like a little baby bunny. You want to hold it loosely, because if you hold it too tight, you're going to kill it. And it's the same with a saw. You're going to screw things up. So it's a very light hold. Start the cut with the saw raised so the teeth are only touching on that far side. I have my blade angled roughly to that slope, and I am not putting any downward pressure on the saw at all. And I'm just going to take a light pull. And as I go deeper, I'm leveling out the saw until it cuts all the way across the end grain. And now I can cut level. Let me get back in the curve. And, try to cut it at that angle. It doesn't matter if it's perfectly on that angle or not. All right. I've cut down to the shoulder. Some people like to go do all of theirs in the same direction at one time and then come back and do the other. I'm one of those people. I'm also using, you can use your thumb or your forefinger to help set the saw in place. I'm leaving the pencil line as best I can. Basswood makes everyone look like a true woodworking champion.
That's why you're using maple.
What's that?
That's why you're using maple.
Yeah. I thought about using maple for the tailboard, and I was like, no. All right. So I've defined all of my tails now. And you can see they're pretty close to being the same angle as the pencil line. So they're closer, some are closer to the pencil line than the others. It doesn't matter. Okay? You do not try to correct this lot when you're cutting. Whatever it is, you let it be. It's more important for that just to be a straight line at whatever angle it is than for you to try to tilt the saw some way to get it back. Don't do that. You want a nice straight line. All right? Now, the next thing I'm going to do is cut off the half pin sockets. So I'm going to go in the vise like this. And I'm going to do something with an eye towards fitting later. I'm going to take my chisel and I'm going to pull out or just cut out the grain right along that marking gauge line. And later on, because the cutting gauge cuts a nice clean square shoulder, and now I've sort of exposed that shoulder. Later, when it comes time to chisel and pare, we're going to use that shoulder cut by the marking gauge to help us know where we should be paring. So now when I cut this free, I'm actually just going to try to leave a little bit of waste on top of the shoulder. All right. Now, you could switch to a crosscut saw here. I didn't think about that because technically it is a crosscut, but this actually cut pretty nicely for a rip saw. Yeah, why don't you just pass me one of the shorter ones. Those are all three the same, but just any one of those. Now we need to get rid of this material in between the tails. We're sort of starting to clean out the pin sockets. Now when I learned to cut dovetails, the guy that taught me how to do it, who I absolutely love, he means everything in the world to me, but he had me chopping out the waste with a chisel and a mallet. A couple of years later, I saw someone doing what I'm about to do, and I was like, what the hell, man? Why was I wasting time chopping out waste with a chisel and a mallet when I could have done this? I've got my blade, so it's angled at about 45 degrees in relation to the frame. I'm going to come down into my kerf. Man, that Japanese saw cuts such a narrow kerf. You want to come down towards the bottom and kind of cut in place, not trying to advance it this, across, but just cut in place as you slowly turn the saw until the blade is parallel with the shoulder, and then cut across. And you want to cut as close to the line as you can, but the first time you do it, first couple times, you might, you can err on the side of too much waste. Come on. All right, so that's out. Man, that is such a narrow curve. All right, we have a question.
Yep, Eric says, do you care which face of the board is out when you clamp it? Wondering about overcutting the outside face versus the inside.
All right, so the question is, does it matter does it matter if it's the outside face or the inside face of the board that is toward me when I'm cutting? I generally do my layout on the outside face of the board. And I want to be able to see the layout lines, so that would be facing towards me. There really shouldn't be any nasty, aggressive tear out. And with practice, you're not going to be cutting beneath the shoulder line. So the only time I guess some people cut beneath the shoulder line is when they're doing the pin board on half-blind socket, half-blind dovetails. Here, you really shouldn't be going beneath the shoulder line.
And he said, what about, I guess he's talking about if you're gang cutting?
If you're gang cutting
at once, like, does it make a difference?
Well, if you're gang cutting, no. What I would do is, because I'm thinking of in the cabinet, okay, here's my outside face, and I want the other one to sort of, the two inside faces touch one another. So I have an outside face here, and then the other board, the outside face would also be on the outside. And it's sort of, for me, that's sort of like, well, that's how it's going to be when it's in the cabinet or in the case. So that's how I'm going to put them together and do the layout. So that's how I would do that. All right, let's get to pairing. I'm going to start with the inside here.
You want to take a break or you want to finish the pairing?
Let's do the pairing first. Now, just like I'm going to sort of cut away the material, just sort of quickly cross grain, take away the material where the shoulder line was. Let's show that. Can you zoom in on that?
Yep.
So you see, I took away that material just quickly by going cross grain, but do you see how clean that shoulder is? When we get to it, that is where I'm going to put the back of my chisel. And that's how I'm going to come out with perfectly good shoulder lines all the way across.
Do you think you could do it on this side? On the camera side? Just to show how you did it?
Yeah.
It was completely buried.
So I would just take my chisel and go like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually I do need to do it on this side, so. All right. So when you're pairing like this, the key to pairing and to keeping your chisels sharp for a long time is to only do a little, you don't try to take it all off at once. And I'm only going to come in halfway. In my last pass, the back of the chisel goes down onto that shoulder cut by the marking gauge. And it is perfectly acceptable to sort of cut down towards the middle so that it's undercut a little bit. The last thing you want is for it to go up towards the middle. Because all the strength of a dovetail comes from here, not from down here. It's the long grain to long grain glue joint. All right, I'll flip this around. Now, the other reason I wanted to use basswood is because it's so quick and easy to pair. We wouldn't, if it was like hard maple, we would be here for like 15 minutes. Like I mentioned earlier, woodworking success, a lot of it comes down to body mechanics. So what am I doing right now? I'm sitting. One, it's more comfortable, but also it gets you down to a better line of sight with the work. Whoops, socket chisel. One thing you want to do is make sure that it's at least square going across. And that's what I'm checking right here. So that is
What angle is your chisel at?
that's a really personal question. Lie-Nielsen chisels, I believe that they come with the main bevel at 30 degrees. So I normally do a secondary bevel when I'm sharpening, and that would be, I think I've been doing that at 35 degrees recently. See, the big myth about end grain and pairing and so forth is that somehow you've got to have really low angles. No, you have to have sharp tools. And a sharp tool, even at 35 degrees, is going to do wonders on end grain. All right, so I've got the two sockets paired down. I got a little too aggressive there, but we'll be all right. So now I'm going to do this end grain, or the edges here, the edge, and I'm going to take that off. All right, so now I have that sort of shoulder created here. And I also have the shoulder, I just cleaned off the shoulder that's out here. This gives me two reference surfaces for my chisel when I get down that low. But first, I'm going to take off just a little bit so you can see, I don't know how well you can see that. I'm not quite down to my marking gauge line yet. But I'm going to come across the width of it in passes, not all at once. And then when it gets down low enough, like we were talking about just a tiny little shaving, I'm going to put it on those shoulders that were created by the marking gauge and push in. And the more I go across, the wider of a reference surface I have for my chisel. But it isn't, so notice that I'm not trying to do this all at once. It's a matter of working across in little swipes. And that's how you can get nice controlled cuts and pairing cuts, and come out with a nice clean shoulder here. So that one's done. I'm going to do the same over here. Now this is a trick. Pairing this way is something I learned from a guy named Phil Lowe, he just recently, actually he died the day the Electoral College vote took place in the Capitol fiasco. He passed away that day. But he was an absolute freaking master furniture maker, and this is something I learned from him when I was working at Fine Woodworking. And it vastly improved my ability to cut really nice tight shoulders out here. He was doing it on a 10-inch shoulder, but I applied it to this, and it works great. All right, I'm just going to make sure that we're nice and clean down in this corner. All right, so that's the tailboard all done. Do not put another cutting tool onto this board. This is done. You do not adjust it at all. Any adjustment for fitting, that takes place on the pin board, okay? So we're going to take just a really quick break, and then we will come back and start up with the transferring the tails to the pin board. Okay? All right. So before we jump to transferring and all that, I want to go back and touch on two things. One, and this is kind of funny, I guess we misunderstood the question about the angle of the chisel. And it's funny because when Joe first asked me the question, what angle's the chisel at, I thought about being a smartass and saying, oh, it's at about, 32 degrees, meaning in reference to the being plumb or being parallel to the ground. Well, it turns out that's actually what the person wanted to know. So I don't know how it looked on screen, but I'm trying to come across it so that it's perfectly level. So that's ideally what you do. I did say that if anything, you could bring it up a little so that you're cutting downwards, so that in the middle of the tailboard it's undercut a little bit, and that's totally fine. Either level or so that you undercut the middle a little bit. Then I guess it wasn't too clear what exact.
And sorry to touch back on that one. And then you pair to the middle so you don't get tear out on the other side. Correct?
Correct. You pair in. So the question was, why am I pairing into the middle of the board and then turning it around? And that's so that you don't break out or get tear out on the far side. That's correct. And I guess there was a little bit of, it wasn't very clear what I was doing out here on the edges. And if we just take like something bigger, so if there's, let's say I've cut and I've got the marking gauge line to follow. What I'm doing is putting the chisel down and just taking off like a 1/16 of an inch, and then moving over and taking off another 1/16 to an 1/8, and then moving over, taking off a little bit more, and working my way across the shoulder like that. So you're not trying to do the entire shoulder at once. That way you're having more, because you have that marking gauge shoulder on two edges, and so you have a double reference, so to speak, to put your chisel down onto and guide it. Is that okay?
I think so. Yeah. We got any other questions? I'll wait a second.
Well, I've got to switch a few things around here. All right.
For the half pin socket, what size chisel would you recommend using?
Well, it depends on the size of it's the full pin socket that is. Are you talking about out here on the side? That's.
Yes.
I don't know. I try to use a wide paring chisel as much as I can. That's what my preference is. So I use a 1-inch chisel a lot for paring. If it fits, I use it. You could use a 3/4 inch chisel too, out there. I would not use an 1/8 inch chisel. I mean, ideally, I like to use something so that if I need to, like, take a last tiny little shaving, I can do it all in one pass. All right. I'm a yawn.
Would a skew chisel help here?
No. No. You don't want a skew chisel. No. Not for this. So now I've got my pin board, and I need to transfer the tails to the pin board. And we're going to do that. I'm going to do that by taking my pin board and clamping it into my vise. Now, I'm going to make use of something that my friend Mike Pekovich invented. A lot of people will take a hand plane and put it here and raise it up to the hand plane. And Mike took a square piece of wood and then glued like a 1/4 inch wider piece of board to one edge of it, one face of it. So it looks like this. So it's a square with a thin, wider piece on top. You take it, you hook the wider lip over the end grain, set it down on the bench, and tighten your vise. So then you come back, you pull it back, you flip it over, and now this surface is at the exact same height as your end grain. And now, so boom, just like that. It's a lot easier than doing the old hand bench plane trick because it has that lip to press the end grain up against when you lock it in the vise.
Magic, says Sean.
Yeah.
It's worth maybe taking part of an afternoon to make some jigs like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, it wouldn't even take it would take you like 20 minutes. All right. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that when you put the tailboard onto the pin board, that it is square in relation. Obviously, this is an exaggeration, right? You don't want that. You want it to be square. And the way that I check for that, no, not that. That's fine. That black, no, the black one there. I usually use my little tiny gray 2-inch engineer square, but I don't. No, that's a 4-inch one.
Yeah, I don't see anything.
Maybe it's probably in the drawer. Anyways, so take a square. A lot of you probably have a square like this. This is sort of an engineer square, and that's the top left-hand drawer. You see? Oh, here it is. This is the one that I always use. Like I said, I have a lot of little baby
you were using it.
layout tools. This is a vintage one made by Brown and Sharp. There used to be in Waterbury, which is the city closest to me, there was a vintage record store where the guy was also like a woodworker and a used tool junkie. So he sold vintage records and CDs and used tools. It was awesome. That's where I got this. So I take this and I put it on the front edge, because if let's say you're making a case piece, the front edge is the one you care about. You want that to be good and flush. If it's a little bit off on the back, it's not the end of the world. You can clean up with a hand plane or whatever, but it's the front that really matters. So I take this, press it against that front edge, but then also bring it up so that it's touching the front edge of the tailboard, and that aligns the front edges. And then you can also press it here if you got that marking gauge in the right place. I'm actually going to just cheat mine. Looking down, you want to make sure that I'm looking down at where this inside face intersects with this inside face. You don't want to see any light coming up through there. So I'm going to cheat mine, and this is something Chris Bexford does. He cheats it just a little bit onto the pin board. And what that does, when you bring the joint together, it'll actually pull things really tight. So I'm going to cheat it a tiny little bit. That's all good. That's all good. It's all good, man. You know that entire TV show is based off that one sort of punny joke?
Which show?
Saul Goodman?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know it?
I know what you're talking about.
So that's his fake name is Saul Goodman, and it comes from Saul Good, man.
I did not know.
Yeah. All right. Now we get to something that might be where I'm a little bit in the minority here of woodworkers, perhaps. I do my transferring with a pencil. What I like about the pencil is I draw the pencil line. That entire pencil line is on top of the pen. And I know that I cannot remove any pencil line. Because if I do, then I'm taking away part of the pen and I'll have a loose joint. I'll have a gappy joint. If you use a marking knife, which I don't have one out because I don't ever freaking use one. Usually a marking knife has a flat back, and then there's going to be, usually it's a spear point, so there's two bevels on the other side. If you put that flat back against the tail and you cut that line, it's actually going to be straight up and down in line with the cheek of the tail. But because it has a bevel on the other side, it's going to actually cut an angled mark like this. And this side of it is on top of your pen. And the problem that a lot of people run into is that they think this side of that cut line is where they're supposed to pair to. But if you pair over to that, you will have a small little gap and a loose fit. All right? Now, I know like Mike Pekovich has a technique for doing this, and he has a different style of marking knife too that sort of eliminates that issue. But I think that, especially when you're first starting out, a pencil line is really good because it's very clear. Do not remove any pencil line, and you're going to be okay. All right, so I'm going to, because these are hand cut, you need to trace the entire tail. And that's what I'm doing now.
What do you mean by the entire tail?
So I'm just running the pencil lead from shoulder out to the end of the tail. Oops. I'm also breaking the pencil lead. There's a little bit of fuzz down in there. Let me get rid of that. All right. Can you see that? So I've transferred them. These pencil lines are completely on top of the pen. They should not be removed at all. At least not when you're cutting. When you get to fitting, you might find that you have to remove a little bit. All right. Now I like to have a visual reference for the vertical part of the cut too. So I'm going to draw a line down. So now I have a vertical, a reference on the face of, the side that's facing me to help me with the vertical orientation of my saw. Goes into the vise. Same body mechanics. You want a clear path for the saw so they can go straight back and forth. And start with the saw on the far edge, the far corner. No downward pressure. It's a cutting tool, and you let the tool do all the cutting. Just like you would not force a board through a table saw, you let it feed through at the rate that the saw is cutting it. Same thing here. This is a little too high, and it's just chattering a little bit. Can you hear the difference when I'm cutting it now? That I've taken that chatter away. And the saw is also cutting more easily.
Wants to know, what do you do if your cut line's starting to drift away from your mark?
Well, if it's drifting away and into the waist, don't do anything. If it's drifting into it, you got to stop. And I would say you can come back up and you could move over further into the waist and come down again. All right? But it's really hard. You can't really correct a saw by doing this to try to get it to... You can't do that. So pull it out, come over. You're just going to have more paring to do. All right. Now I'm going to cut out the waist. And again, with the coping saw. So I always do that. I always get it. All right, that's pretty good. Good way to break a coping saw blade. There we go.
So Sean asks, can you quickly explain the old school chiseling out the waste with a mallet?
Can I quickly explain how to chisel out waste with a mallet and a chisel? Yeah, here's the quickest explanation. Do not do it. Yeah, what you would do on these, you would have your chisel inside the shoulder line. Tap, tap. Come in, pop, 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 pops off the waist. Tap, 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 pop, 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 tap, 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 pop, 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 tap, 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 pop, pop, pop. Until you get, you can go down halfway, then you flip it over and go from the other side. And then you would pare down to the shoulder line the same way I've been doing it. It's tedious, it takes a long time, and I don't see why anyone would do it if you have access to a coping saw.
And it wears your edge down.
Yeah, and it makes your chisel dull a lot faster. All right, so I've coped out the waste. I'm ready to start paring.
I'm going to show the pencils on the front, on the top thing. Yeah, there you go. Sorry. 1 second. Focus.
Got it? And there too?
Got it.
All right. Okay, I'm going to start coming in from the outside. And I'm going to reveal that shoulder. I'm always fascinated by the different sounds woodworkers make when they're talking about things. Like, there's one guy that when he's talking about cutting stuff, he's like, you go bunk, bunk, bunk. And and then my buddy Kelly always goes, whoosh, 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 and I was just what was I doing? Going bip, 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 bunk, 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 bip, bip, bip.
Joe says, can you give a quick explanation of how Pekovich uses the blue tape? I've heard him explain it and can never picture it in my head.
I can, but I'm not going to, because I've only done it like once in my life. There's an article about it in Fine Woodworking from probably like 5 years ago or something. It's also in Mike's book, The How and Why of Woodworking. So I know how to do it. I've done it like once or twice. I get why he does it. It works really well, but I don't really. I not off the top of my head, I can't do it now. I'd have to sit down and think about it and how I'd want to talk about it. But I mean, you should go read Mike's article about it, or get his book and read his book because it's in there too.
On this side, do you think you can pare away like you just did on this side without flipping the board so we can see it video side?
Yeah. Anyways, that question, in case you didn't hear, was someone asked if I would explain Mike's blue tape trick.
There you go.
That's kind of like asking Johnny Marr if he'll explain Keith Richards' guitar solo. It's like, no. All right. Oh, this is a lot of paring to do. All right. I wish I'd gotten closer to the shoulder line.
We all do.
Let's get us something a little bit narrower first. Please, sir, can we add another lump of coal?
It's pretty quiet.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking like.
Anybody got any 17 jokes they want to tell?
No, I was just like, I would just. I mean, like, yeah, I can do hand cut dovetails, but I would never do that. I was like, I don't want to do this. This takes forever.
If you're trying to get away from your spouse, it totally makes sense. But
Well, you know, if you can cut good hand cut dovetails, you can cut a good dovetail using any tools, because it's a good way to really learn what's important when it comes to dovetails. Mm-hmm. You know, because you're so intimately connected to all parts of the cutting of the making of the dovetail. So. Bum, bum, bum. Bip, bip, bip. Bum, bum, bum. Whip, whip, whip. Any questions?
yeah, why is Matt so slow at cutting hand cut dovetails?
He's pretty slow, but he's faster than whoever asked that question.
That was me.
Oh, was it you? Yeah, I'm definitely faster than you.
What about using a router for this part?
Yeah, that's actually, we're going to cover that in the third lesson.
Gosh, slow down, Eric. Said trying to spark conversation. Definitely sparked some conversation.
Well, why don't y'all ask me how George Nakashima did something?
He said, Sean says, with the coping size, you're trying to get as close as possible to the line to leave the space.
Yeah, so that there's very little pairing to do. I was not very successful with that tonight.
Camera shy.
I'm just drunk. I've been drinking since 11 o'clock Eastern time.
Sean said, me too. Well, while you're at it, Sean, there's some more classes coming out. Just sign up.
Yeah. There's lots of stuff you can buy on my website while you're drunk, Sean. I hate doing this side.
Andrew says, how many fish did Joe catch? On the days that Matt was not with me, a lot.
Oh, he always catches a lot when I'm not with him.
So for those of you that weren't in the last class, Matt and I were going fly fishing quite a bit, and we would talk about it during the classes. Matt would give me crap about how many he caught to how many I caught. So. Haven't gone recently though, Andrew.
Yeah, I haven't been since the time I took my son that last time.
Yeah, I think I went once after that, the last time you and I went, and then I got a puppy.
Oh, I think you and I went together after that, right?
Yeah, and that was it.
Yeah.
And then Christmas, and then, right? That was before Christmas?
Yeah.
Yeah. Christmas, New Year, and then a dog. Genie, we think he's a rescue. We think he was a Catahoula leopard. He's pretty cool.
So you notice I am moving my body around a lot. And that's so that as they say in golf, address the ball. So it's the position my body is in relation to the work I'm doing is as advantageous as I can get it. Kind of think I should have used basswood for pinboard too.
Trying to be helpful and make it contrasty, I get it.
All right. It's all good. All right. Man, it's always the back side of that coping saw cut that I just never get it low enough.
Any podcast jokes, Matt, you want to share?
No. I did hear some pretty good jokes today, but I probably shouldn't repeat any of them.
Yeah. Sean says, what's it like teaching online?
I don't know. I mean, I spend a lot of time in my shop talking to myself anyways, so it's kind of like that. Teaching in person is preferable, because, you would be cutting dovetails right now and I could watch you and say, oh, okay, well, look, you got to change your body like this, or, look at the way your pin is. That's why it's not going together. So that's kind of an advantage for you to be doing it in person. But when I do it like this, I have lots of time to sort of plan, because, I know, like, okay, this is what my setup is like, and I can do things the exact way that I always do them. Whereas when I go to a school somewhere, there's no telling, what I'm going to run into in terms of benches or tools available, and you might have to change things on the fly. And so when I'm doing this, like tonight online, this is really how I would do it in my shop. And so as I'm working, I'm able to think like, okay, look, I just did something, and I know it's a small thing, but they probably didn't see it, but I should point this out because this is a really important thing that I just did. It's something that really helps my dovetails turn out well. When I'm away from the shop and I have to think about and in some regards worry about 10 people, it's much harder to focus on my own work. Because you're focused on the work of 10 or 12 or 13 other people and their safety. Tonight you could be sleeping in your lounge chair for all I know. And drinking a beer.
Or wine, like Jeannie.
Or wine, or wearing a tuxedo t-shirt and no pants, which is what Joe's doing.
Poor Matt.
Okay. That's all good. So I know that this is not going to fit, but I'm going to give it a little whirl anyways, just to see how close I am. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now, on a piece of wood, if the grain on this edge is running down in that direction, the grain on this edge is going to be running up. So if you pair straight down like this, see how it was catching and it's not going down that easy? That's because I'm pairing against the grain. So on this side of all the pins, I would be going against the grain. On this side, see how easier it is? That's because I'm going with the grain. So you have to be really careful if you're going to come down straight down the edge like this. One, you better be sharp, and two, you better be careful, because if you're going against the grain, it could easily dig in under the grain and cut into the pin. It's easier and a little more controlled to go across like I just am doing now. And over here on the edge, it is tremendously not a good idea to come down like this. Because it's very easy, like as if you're splitting firewood, to get that knife and it just goes right down in the grain and keeps going, and that pin pops off. Now, of course, everything is easier and more accurate if your chisel is actually sharp. One of the places that you will run into problems when you're doing hand-cut dovetails is that the pin flares out as it goes down. And that will keep you from closing up the joint. So you can check that, like I just did. You could use a combination square. This is a little double square, and I can just put it in there and bring it over, and I can see whether or not my pin is square to the shoulder.
How did you know where to pair? Did you sight down from the tailboard?
Well, I wasn't to my pencil lines yet, so that was one thing. I put a little bit of pressure on the tailboard, and I can look at the underside and see where it dented where the pins dented the tailboard. And then also, like I said, you can do this trickaroo here, and that shows you where, like if it flares out towards the bottom. In other words, you don't want bell bottoms. You want good straight leg jeans. And if you're over 30, they should not be skinny jeans. Who am I kidding? I wear skinny jeans all the time. It's so inappropriate. But I'm a thin fella. All right. Let's see how this goes. All right. Why don't you get me one of my Japanese whackers?
Like this one?
Nah, the smaller one. This is good. So one of the nice things about basswood is that it compresses. So you can leave it a little, maybe it might be a little tight. Yeah, I can tell. So there's a little bit of a gap at the top here, and that's because it's probably a little flared out. So as the tail goes down in, it starts to sort of force it open. But all in all, it's a pretty good fit, and there's a tiny little crack right there. And that means that the pin needs just a little bit of paring. And it's almost certainly down at the bottom where it's a problem.
Tim wants to know, do you offer chisel sharpening class?
I have I can do that. I've done some like private sharpening stuff, both online and in person. So I mean, yeah, and I guess I could do something like this as a sharpening class. Sharpening is the kind of thing you really want to learn either in person or in a very small online thing, because you really want to be able to ask questions. And normally what I do when I teach sharpening is I have people bring a chisel and a plane blade, and then they sharpen that before they leave, so that they can see and feel that. Like, so first I let them use my tools so they can see and feel what sharp is before they even try to sharpen something. And then we actually go through the process of sharpening two of their tools, so they can do the process themselves, but then leave with something that's sharp as a reference.
We did a pretty decent rudimentary YouTube one.
Hey, why don't tell them there's a free one?
Yeah.
Yeah, actually there is, like on my YouTube channel, there is like a free thing.
Sean says, are you looking for a hammer fit, loose fit? How do you know when it's right?
You should be able to, put it together like this. If you're really having to smack it with a hammer, then it's too tight, and you're probably going to crack some pins anyways. So this came together, and so one of the things I was thinking about, and we're just at 9 o'clock now, so we'll take a few more minutes. But that's my water, right?
Yeah.
You need water.
No. Don't spill it.
Yeah. Did you zoom in on the joint at all to show it? And I can move it around if you want to. Yeah, this is so this shoulder came out nice here. That one's a little gappy, but I would personally, I would leave that. Sometimes the solution is worse than the problem, and that's a place where no matter what you try to do to fix that, it's not going to look good. It's a little bit gappy right there, but again, I would leave that. That's really not problematic. Everywhere else, it's you can see. This is just probably an issue of the board being a little cupped, but that would glue down nice and tight. So all in all, these are. I mean, this is a joint I would leave as is. And I was thinking, okay, well, what do you do if you have to fix a joint? Well, if you have a real problem, what if your pins are just really loose? Well, first of all, you're not going to do anything to your tailboard. Do not touch your tailboard. What you would do...
Like if you cut on the wrong side of the line.
Yeah, if you cut on the wrong side of the pin, or you end up with like an 1/8 inch gap because of, you got distracted by something while you were repairing and you were watching the Real Housewives of Ye Old Plymouth while you were repairing. What you would do is take a piece. You could take a piece of. Well, this offcut's not going to quite work, but normally I hang on to my offcuts until I'm done, like I've glued up the case. You could cut a piece off of it and try to match the grain direction and everything as best you can, and then glue the face grain to face grain. So you would glue that back on there, let it dry. Do it with yellow glue, put it on there, tape it or clamp it or something, and let it dry, and then transfer that one pen socket. Transfer it again and recut it. That's going to look a lot better than like driving a wedge down into it afterwards. Driving a wedge down in there can deform the tail, and that is noticeable. So it's better to glue on a piece, retransfer, and recut and refit. That's probably the big one that you're going to have to really worry about. If you screw up the shoulder line, you're kind of stuck. There's not a good repair there. I guess you could try to knock a wedge in, but you got to be careful. You don't want it to be like a wedge where you see end grain. It's got to be a wedge where face grain would be visible. And those are very delicate. They tend to break. So it's a trickier thing to do. And you can't really glue something on there because end grain to end grain doesn't glue well, especially when you're trying to leave something that's like a 32nd of an inch thick. So, the most important thing that you can do is practice. You can just practice by making stuff, and that's the fun way. But you can also practice just by going and buying some pine or poplar or cherry or something, some hardwood, and just every weekend go out and cut a through dovetail with your hand tools. You will get better by practice and by sending Joe questions. Any questions?
Nothing yet.
So we'll get the video uploaded tomorrow in the morning, right?
Yep.
And then I'll also tomorrow morning set up the community for this class, so you can ask questions there. I'd love to tell you that I will do it tonight, but I am 100% confident that when this camera gets turned off, I'm going to drink a beer and there will not be any more work done today. I've been working for about 15 hours.
Me too. Frank says, "What's the next class?" And I'm not sure if he means the next class in this series or the next class.
So someone asked what the next class is. I'll answer that two ways. Next Wednesday, we are going to do table saw dovetails. So we will cut both the tails in the pin and the pins on the table saw.
Next dovetail class.
Yeah, so that's the next one. The third one, we will cut the tails with a bandsaw, and we will route the pins. And then the fourth and final one, we will talk about half-blind dovetails. And if they're... I was just thinking, maybe we should look at some actual fixes for problems. But I just explained really the best one, which is to glue a piece back on when you screw up a pin. You would clean that up so it's nice and flat and smooth, and then glue a piece on there, and then retransfer it and recut it and refit it. Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, Are there
I
any?
want to know if the videos are downloadable. I don't think they are, but they're on the site and they're not going anywhere.
Yeah, someone asked if the videos are down, if you can download them. I know you cannot, but you can watch them whenever. Once after we put it up, you can watch it whenever. And I have no plans. It is my intention for them to be available for all eternity.
Yeah.
Eventually I'm going to stop using Thinkific, and I will have my own website, and then the videos will be there, and you will still have access to them. I don't know when that's going to happen, but you should. Unless I'm 75 years old and I just don't feel like maintaining it anymore. But at that point, you would have 30 years of access to it. So that's probably a fair shake.
Colin says, will you be hosting another 6-lesson angering wall cabinet course this year? It's actually still up, so the video quality in the beginning was a little questionable, but other than that, it's still up there.
Yeah, so the 6-lesson ingrain course is available to watch now. I don't know if I would do another one live so soon, but I do plan to do another piece of furniture this year. All right. Are there any other woodworking questions?
Nope, I don't think so.
No? Well, I didn't say this earlier, but thank you for signing up for the class. I greatly appreciate it. So does Joe. And I certainly enjoy doing them. And I also appreciate the business. And we look forward to next week. And in the meantime, everyone have a good weekend. And if you have questions in between now and next Wednesday, again, the community will be set up tomorrow morning when I get up. And you can ask questions there. And I get notified anytime someone posts a question or comment to it. And I typically respond within an hour. All right?
All right.